that we are live.
Whoa.
Hello, everybody. My name is Roy Arthur Blodgett, and I'll be your host today for this fun and fascinating conversation about gradients as they're applied to herpetoculture.
Hmm.
Phil, you want to give your little intro?
Yeah. Hello. I'm Philip Leitz, Arid's only. Just excited to do this. Love talking nitty gritty, nerdy reptile stuff. So this is gonna be great fun.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've often talked, Phil and I, about kind of devising our own standard kind of curriculum and approach to teaching herpetoculture from the ground up. And we kind of consider gradients to be like one of those foundational, fundamental pillar understandings that you can kind of build off of that apply throughout herpetoculture. And you can think of all kinds of different ways to apply gradients to the benefit of your animals. And so, I'm really excited to go over this presentation and yeah, hopefully offer something useful for everybody.
Yeah. And
So,
admittedly oft overlooked.
yes,
Yeah.
very often overlooked. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think we're just going to dive right into it
Yeah.
and see how it goes. So, I'm going to share my screen. It's going to be a little bit clunky in this transition here, but should be fine. Here. All right, here it goes.
Look at that pretty text typeface. My goodness.
Okay. Herpetoculture fundamentals, gradients. So I'm going to kind of read through our slides, and Phil is going to provide some kind of color commentary as we go through and provide some of his insight on top of these slides that I prepared. And we'll just go through and towards the end, we're going to have a Q&A session as well, where we can kind of answer questions and hopefully clarify anything that gets misunderstood, anything like that. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the live chat, or you can save them until the Q&A section. We'll get to them then.
Hmm.
So, in the best practice of herpetoculture, there are few concepts more important than that of gradients. Gradients, when appropriately established in the captive setting, provide our animals with the capacity to essentially take care of themselves. They do so by relying on the inherent wisdom which exists in the biology of all herpetofauna. Here we have photographed a beautiful Uromastix thomasi produced by our very own Philip Leitz.
Oh.
So, reptiles and amphibians are quite famously ectotherms, meaning they rely on external sources to maintain their body temperature. To be even more precise, they are poikilotherms, and as such, they are able to operate under a wide range of internal body temperatures. So, unlike people who are constantly striving to maintain homeostasis and kind of keep our body temperature right around that 98.6 degrees magic temperature, reptiles can be well and active and can kind of survive and thrive under a whole bunch of different temperatures and internal body temperatures.
Oh, and
And that is
something.
what.
Oh,
Oh yeah,
sorry.
go ahead, Phil.
I was
Go
just going
ahead.
to add something at the beginning. A lot of times gradients can be kind of an abstract term, because at least in herpetoculture, we understand gradient. What a lot of people think thermal gradient, but for me,
Right.
the way my mind conceptualizes gradients is like a visual gradient, thinking of like a color
Mm,
scale or a value scale. So if you're a visual type learner and it helps you to picture something in your mind, think of like a scale of squares that goes from black to white or from red to white or blue to black or whatever. So what you're getting is a gradient, a gradation of color that can either be in terms of value from light to dark, or can be in terms of saturation from more saturated to less saturated. This is just like a helpful visual when you're thinking of gradients and how it's going to apply to the rest of the conversation.
yeah, I love that. I love that kind of visual visual representation of what they are.
Helps me anyway.
Totally, yeah. So because of this ectothermic poikilothermic condition, reptiles and amphibians must utilize behavioral adjustments such as basking or seeking shade to maintain their body temperatures and achieve optimal function. And so when I'm talking about optimal function, I am referring to essentially regulating their metabolic rate. So they can, seek warmer temperatures to speed up their metabolism, to activate their metabolism to a different level. They can also choose to seek cooler temperatures to slow their metabolism. And of course, this relates to how our animals might endure through different conditions, such as, you know, seasonal changes, like what precipitates brumation in some animals.
Hmm.
So it is precisely this attribute, their thermal ecology, which allows reptiles and amphibians to be so profoundly efficient and broadly successful as organisms. And by contrast, mammals, such as human beings, are incredibly inefficient. And to illustrate this, I often hear about this one statistic that I've heard cited quite regularly that talks about the kind of breakdown of how our caloric intake then can be applied to our efficiency essentially. And in the case of mammals and human beings, around roughly around 98% of the calories we consume go to sustaining our internal body temperature, go to sustaining that homeostasis that I mentioned earlier, which only leaves about 2% of that remaining caloric energy available for growth and recovery and repair, all those other necessarily body functions. And in reptiles, that can sometimes be almost entirely inverted, where reptiles can have up to 90% of their caloric energy stored essentially for growth and recovery, repair, these other necessary functions, which allows them to consume a lot less food, obviously. In the case of like this snake, this photographed here, it's a tricolor hognose snake, Xenodon pulcher, and this was a male tricolor that I kept here for several years. And on average, I fed him one small mouse per month, or one or two reptilinks per month, and that was all he needed to thrive. If
Excellent.
you can imagine, it's quite a difference from what I would have to eat in a month to thrive.
And excuse me, interesting to note too is like I think it can be just based on the way we the kind of note the common language around keeping reptiles and amphibians can go is, we'll have a tendency to think of them as sort of on or off, right? If they're warmed up, quote, fired up, which is a term I kind of despise generally speaking, but like
Mhm.
it can be very easy to fall into a mode of thinking where you're assuming that they're either on or off, and therefore if they're hot, that's when they're doing everything necessary and all the important stuff, and when they're cold, they're off, they're doing nothing, they're not doing the important stuff. But it's not an on or off switch at all. It's just different modes of existence that all have
Mhm.
equal value.
Yeah, very well stated. Love that. So, of course, this attribute also suggests some vulnerability because while we and many other mammals are able to sweat as we get too warm and thereby cool ourselves through evaporation, herpetofauna are forced to find external environments where they can reduce their body temperatures. In most cases, this looks like retreating into a refugium of some kind, such as a burrow, a tree cavity, or a rock crevice. And here you have beautiful Egyptian uromastyx, emerging from a refugium in the vivarium there. So cooling down, however, is not the only reason why herpetofauna seek such refugia. Sometimes they're simply seeking security, hiding, while in other instances they might be in search of environments possessing higher ambient humidity to avoid desiccation. This is especially true in arid regions where water is in short supply and where such humid retreats are essential for the survival of herpetofauna. So there have been some really interesting studies about this tendency, especially again in desert adapted species to seek burrows and stuff like that. I think that Emily Taylor's physical ecology lab over at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo, they've done some interesting studies about this with blunt nosed leopard lizards, which is a really amazing
Mhm.
crotophytid lizard. And basically, they're finding these environments underground where water is essentially stored and it's trapped. This is the same reason why, when you're a kiddo and you're out looking for reptiles, you're lifting up rocks and logs and stuff like that. It's because these surface cover items essentially trap moisture beneath them, and they provide just areas of just it can even just be a few percentage points higher of relative humidity, but that is all it takes for these reptiles to avoid rapid water loss essentially,
Mhm.
especially in really harsh environments. So, this reliance on small scale refugia and specific ranges of conditions for optimal function leads to the majority of herpetofauna being classified as microhabitat specialists. They are experts at utilizing small pockets of difference within larger habitat structures to secure their ongoing well being and survival. And again, I'm speaking to this childhood impulse that so many reptile folks have to look for critters under rocks, logs, and other bits of debris. This is relying heavily on this pattern in herpetofauna to exploit the benefits of microhabitats. So there are some species, within the kind of like field herping community that have this kind of grail quality. I think of like California mountain king snakes, the
Mm.
Lampropeltis zonata, the other mountain kings, some of the montane rattlesnakes. These are all considered kind of these special grail species to see in the field, and many of them are often these microhabitat specialists that that have actually pretty narrow optimum ranges, and that's what makes them harder to see in the field. It's like where I live, for example. California mountain king snakes are found here, not too far from me, just a couple thousand feet up in elevation, about a 30-minute drive from me. But it's extremely difficult to see them because the essential time that they are active around where I live is just a few weeks per year, because the rest of the year it's just too harsh here for them to be surface active. They're deep in these fissures in the earth and these crevices, and you can't find them.
Yeah, that's great. And how some of this kind of, I mean, obviously we're getting into this now per this slide. How does all of this apply? Whether we're talking about herpetoculture or exploring herps in the field, um, the basic, the basic takeaway, the basic tenet of this is that uh, reverse engineering and examining why you're finding reptiles or amphibians where they are, the why and the where is where you're going to pull wisdom from, because that
Right.
is a piece of insight that tells you something about the psychology and physiology of your animal. And therefore, we've all had this weird experience where we set up an enclosure that we think is perfect, and the herp that we put in that enclosure finds some bizarre hiding space that we didn't anticipate them favoring, or something of that nature, and that tells you something about what they're seeking, right? So
Right.
this is stuff. This is all info. This is informative for what you're doing and how you're interacting with your herbs.
Yeah, it's so well said. And this is again another reason why I consider gradients so foundational in terms of
Mhm.
how we take care of our animals, is that if you establish a wide gradient from the outset with your animal, and then you observe your animal closely, your animal will essentially tell you what it needs, and how you might be able to refine the design of your habitat to better suit your animal. So
Absolutely.
again, this is where what we're getting to now. This photo here is an example of a classic microhabitat specialist. This is a Xenosaurus numanorum, a species I kept here for several years. And they essentially live in these very narrow crevices in the Chilitla region of San Luis Potosi in Mexico. So there are many different types of gradients that can be established in the vivarium setting, including but not limited to the following: heat, from hot basking areas to cool shelters; light, from bright, light rich areas to dark, secluded ones; humidity, from dry areas to moist ones; and another one that I like to talk about a lot is exposure. So from open areas with unobstructed views to completely sheltered ones and in between. So we're going to discuss each of these in more detail in the remainder of our presentation here.
And also worth noting, as Roy says in that, as he just noted, that it's not limited to those. I
Right.
think this is a very important takeaway also, because gradients apply to everything, including diet, right? Dietary gradients and seasonal gradients and all of that stuff. But the ones that we have that Roy put together here in this slide show is intended to kind of simplify and get down to some of the base ones.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe the most important one to start with is the heat gradient. So establishing a proper heat gradient is one of the most important aspects of designing a functional enclosure for herpetofauna. In fact, there are few aspects of enclosure design with greater consequences.
Mm.
Fortunately, they are quite simple to achieve. In most basic terms, a heat gradient can be established by simply placing the heat element on one end of the enclosure. As long as the enclosure is properly ventilated, and this is really important, I'll get to this in a moment, this will allow for one end of the enclosure to maintain a basking area warmer than the other end of the enclosure, which should remain cool, allowing the enclosure occupant to self regulate. So I want to draw everyone's attention to this really simplified diagram here that I've made. You see this orange cone that represents the heat element. In my case, I always advocate for a halogen or an incandescent bulb as a heat element, something that produces light, and they produce a really nice quality of heat that's rich in infrared A, which is the closest thing we have to replicate the sun, the warmth of the sun, I should say, in the vivarium setting. So here you have that on one end, and then I've got these two air indicators of airflow, these two arrows. I noticed that the one close to the heat element is high up, and the one opposite the heat element is low down. And the reason for this is to represent essentially ventilation in an enclosure. So you want your ventilation in your habitat to be on a differential, essentially. So the natural tendency for warm air is to rise. And so if you have ventilation up high near your heat element, that warm air is going to want to rise. It's gonna leave through the ventilation of your enclosure, and as it does so, it will create a pressure differential that will actually pull cool air in on the opposite side of your enclosure through those low vents. If you have your ventilation all at the same level in your enclosure, you don't have this same convection effect. And it's not as functional in creating kind of this passive airflow that helps to prevent stagnant air in the enclosure. And it also helps to prevent the enclosure from overheating, because cool air is going to be lower, hot air is going to be higher. As that hot air escapes, it's going to pull in um, cool air. Convection is the principle behind this. So, in sufficiently large enclosures, you can also sometimes establish more than one basking area. So, with more than one heat gradient present within the same enclosure. This is especially true with open topped, screen topped, or very tall enclosures, which allow for maximum airflow and which do not trap heat in the same way that more enclosed spaces do. So, in this example photograph, this is an 8 foot by 3 foot by 6 foot enclosure that houses a Suriname themed biotope here. The primary species in there is Spilotes sulphureus, but I have a couple other lizard species that live alongside them. And there's actually three separate basking areas in this enclosure to maximize opportunity for the different occupants to thermoregulate. And the reason why I'm able to do that is because this is such a tall enclosure. And so there's a lot of vertical space to allow for a thermal gradient. So up in the top end of that enclosure, it's nice and warm, and then down lower in the enclosure, it's much cooler. And you can actually see this pressure differential that I was speaking to. You can see those low vents right below the door opening, and you can see up top where that orange glow is coming down. That's where the screen outlets are for the halogens. You can see that differential that allows for the convection airflow. And this also is how a lot of Phil's enclosures work as well, because he utilizes a lot of open topped large, essentially pens for his arid lizards. These aren't trapping heat at all in the way that like an enclosed PVC enclosure would. There's a lot of opportunity for that heat to escape.
Mhm.
And so he doesn't have to worry as much about, again, overheating the enclosure.
Yeah, it ends up kind of being the opposite concern. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
It makes it harder in some ways because you have to use much higher wattage in a lot of cases, right?
Yes, that's right. But it
But
also speaks to it, that difference really speaks to the trade-off that you're always having to make, right? There's always going to be
right.
some element of trade-off in which, in what we do, which is why we work on efficiency, because the more efficient we get, the fewer trade-offs we have to make.
Yeah, well said. So the next gradient that we're going to talk about a little bit here is the light gradient. So this is very simple to achieve in the vivarium by utilizing fluorescent and or LED bulbs. Can establish areas in the enclosure that are flooded with light while allowing other areas to remain dark and or sheltered from light. If the light fixture spans the full length of the setup, the keeper can establish areas of shade and darkness by utilizing vivarium to decor to block the flow of light. So I like to use this photograph as a depiction of this because this is actually a pretty brightly lit enclosure. The bulbs that I used in here, there's an Arcadia T5 for UV and an LED supplemental for the plants in there, in addition to a little halogen for a basking area. And they actually span the lights span the whole length of this enclosure, and so there's not it's not the same as having say a 2 foot LED in a 4 foot enclosure where you're creating a lot of light on one half of that enclosure, and then the darkness is going to be opposite to that in the other section of the enclosure. In this case, I opted to create a really brightly lit enclosure, but create a lot of obstructions to that light to allow for shade. And so you can see that in these areas of deep shade, under the rock ledges and under the branch structures and all of that. So essentially, my goal here, this was again the vivarium that I made for the Xenosaurus numanorum, those Mexican knob-scaled lizards. And these are pretty shy lizards that in their native range very rarely leave these rock crevices. And so my goal was to establish an enclosure where they could essentially move through crevices and through darkness from one side of the enclosure without ever being in full light. And you can see that how that's easily achievable in the way that this enclosure is laid up.
Yeah, it's super nice. And this is also where uh dimensionality and three dimensionality
Hmm.
specifically inside your enclosure space is going to become much more important, like on a visual level, right? Because now oftentimes you see sort of relatively flat dimensionality utilized in certain enclosure styles where things either hug the walls or they're not built up more than a couple of layers from the base of the from the base floor of the enclosure. And so by using a lighting gradient again as sort of a visual guide, that's going to push you and guide you towards using more utilizing more of that 3D space inside that takes up all that airspace. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Instead of being pushed against the sides or pushed down to the floor, right? You're because that open air space that just doesn't get utilized anymore if there's not anything that occupies it for the animals to interact with.
Yeah, that's so well said. I think that this is like one of the things I most commonly see, especially for
Yeah.
folks that are new to herpetoculture, and new to kind of setting up a vivarium, is not utilizing the full volume
Yeah.
that is present there. And this is something that we're going to be discussing more in a future webinar as well, focus more on kind of you know vivarium composition and design in that
Yes.
respect, but it's super important as it relates
Big
to
deal.
gradients and it's particularly light.
Hmm.
So, as always, it is important to consider the natural habitat of the species you are keeping when establishing your light gradient. Is it a species from an arid region where light is abundant, or is it a species that inhabits the dark, damp understory of the tropical rainforest where light is a really precious, rare resource? Having an idea of the microhabitat composition that your species would utilize in nature is very informative in establishing your ideal gradient. So, here you have one of Phil's open topped pens for Eurymastix ornata. And you can see that it's like this is very brightly lit, it's nice and open. And there are areas where these lizards can escape that light. They can get down into these boulder piles essentially that are created here for them. But their natural condition, if you're say go on iNaturalist and look up Eurymastix ornata, and I encourage you to do this for any of the species that you keep.
Hmm.
Go on iNaturalist, go to the gallery view of observations, and just get an idea of like where are people observing these animals? What is their natural condition and their habitat? Try to let that inform how you're setting up the habitat and also how you're lighting it. So moving on, one of the more nuanced gradients to establish in the vivarium is the humidity gradient. And in some cases, one can establish a moisture differential really easily by simply overfilling the water bowl occasionally when you're filling it, and thereby wetting the substrate on the cool end of the enclosure while allowing the warm end of the setup to remain dry. One can also add small amounts of water to deep vivarium substrate, whether by pouring or misting, allowing the top layers of substrate to remain dry while the bottom layers retain more humidity. Again, that's kind of, is similar to what those arid species are seeking in going into these burrows. This is not achievable with every type of substrate, though, and a humid hide or a container filled with moist substrate, such as sphagnum moss, is one way to still achieve this desired gradient. So, again, I have this really simple visual diagram here of just the basic simplest way to establish a moisture gradient or a humidity gradient, and that's basically just, you have your heat element that's going to be primarily warm and dry, and on the opposite end, where ideally you have your water bowl on the opposite side, you can kind of cultivate more moisture and a cooler environment for your animal. um, Again, like I said, with that tricolor hognose that I was showing earlier, or the Xenodon dorbignii, the South American hognose, which was also pictured earlier in the presentation. The way that I achieve their humidity gradient is actually I just overfill their water bowls when I go to replace the water every day, and I'm filling it back up. I just let it spill over a little bit, and that allows the water underneath their water bowls or the substrate underneath their water bowls to stay nice and moist. They can hide under their water bowls if they want, or because those are burrowing species, they can burrow down into that substrate. And if I was to kind of scrape back just the top inch or so of the substrate beneath, I would find that it's a lot moister on that cool side of the enclosure. Whereas if I go over to the warm side where the halogen is, the heat element, and I dig over there, it's going to remain dry, pretty much down to the bottom of that enclosure. Whereas if I was, doing this in a much, much larger setup, or something like Phil's open topped pens, where, the gradient is less, you know, end to end,
Mhm,
it's more vertical.
mhm.
I would probably just like every once in a while pour in a gallon of water into the substrate and
That
and
is
like and let it dry out on the top layer and stay wet down underneath. But is
that
that
is
is that what you do,
that is
Phil?
exactly what I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a combination of, like, as you said, periodically dumping in from a pitcher, literally just dumping water
Yeah.
in over the basking area, over all of the stones in one area, over a water bowl, like, you name it. And then it also looks like occasionally just misting specific sections of the enclosure. Like, I'm, taking the mister and putting the end of the nozzle underneath the bottommost hiding spaces and just soaking that down for a few seconds. That kind of stuff. I mean, it's all the time, and it's relatively randomized, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's very good to do.
I love that. Another thing I've noticed that really helps with establishing humidity gradients, especially for like tropical species,
Mhm.
for those of us who live in climates that are not tropical, there's a constant challenge to maintain enough humidity for your
Yeah.
for your tropical species. And so, I have most of my tropical Vivaria set up on a misting system. And one thing I've noticed that really helps to regulate and maintain humidity is to incorporate live plants. And part of the reason for that is that they have this they create so much surface area and so much complexity. And so, when the misters are going off, they're misting all those live plants. They're forming all these droplets on these leaves, and those leaves are essentially layered on top of each other, right, through the depth and the volume of the enclosure. They're evaporating at kind of different rates. So the leaves that are more exposed to the heat element are going to evaporate first. The ones that are further away from the heat element are going to evaporate a bit slower, and that helps to maintain a kind of regular, evaporative increase in humidity throughout the vivarium. And this also brings up the point that if you do have, tropical species, you may think like, oh, I want it to be, I want them to be wet all the time, basically, because like that's how it is in the jungle. And it's still important, I think, even with species that do prefer a lot higher natural humidity, ambient humidity, to create areas that are still nice and warm and dry,
Yeah.
where they can escape that. Because it's very common for folks to actually keep their animals too wet when they're working with tropical species, and this can lead to a whole host of issues from kind of skin problems,
Hmm.
like blisters, to respiratory infections and a whole bunch of other stuff. So
Yeah,
again, the gradient is what's important there.
it cuts both directions. Dry stuff needs
Yeah,
to get wet sometimes. Wet stuff needs to get dry sometimes.
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so again, keeping in mind the natural habitat of the species you're keeping when establishing your humidity gradient is really important. So, a species from an arid region may not require much moisture at all, with just a humid hide being more than sufficient to meet their needs. Whereas a tropical species may need an environment with much higher ambient humidity and regular misting or even overnight fogging to remain healthy and properly hydrated. And again, that said, even with tropical Vivaria, it is always wise to allow the environment to dry out a bit between misting sessions. The key, as always, is to provide a range of options for your animal to meet its needs. So, moving on, the last gradient we'd like to discuss today is the exposure gradient, which pertains to the amount of visual barriers used in the enclosure to provide security and or visual stimuli. As before, having a basis of understanding in your animal's natural ecology is important information in meeting this need. Some species prefer open areas with long lines of sight, while others greatly prefer highly cluttered spaces where they can effectively hide while still meeting their needs for heat, light, and moisture. This is another aspect in which knowing the preferred microhabitat of your species is extremely helpful. So, again, I've got the Xenosaurus here photographed, and this is a species that is super shy, and you would rarely see them out in the open. If especially if they're in like a high traffic area of your house or your reptile room, if you didn't provide some kind of visual clutter in their environment to help them feel a bit more secure. And so I love this photograph in particular because it illustrates like this lizard is actually pretty exposed for what this species prefer, which is usually to be fully wedged into a crevice. In this case, it's got the first, 20% of its body or so exposed. But partially, it felt safe to do that, even with me getting pretty close with my, macro lens on my camera, because between us, between me and the camera and the lizard, there's this visual clutter created by the foliage in the vivarium. Just helps to provide a little bit more safety for the animal. So, in some respects, the exposure gradient can be interpreted as a combination of all of these other gradients that we're talking about, but with a key difference. In considering the exposure gradient, we're seeking to provide more for the psychological needs of the animal than for its physiological needs, if such a distinction can even be made. So, consider the sandfish habitat shown below. This is one of Phil's setups in the past. So, this is an ideal setup for a species that has evolved in the wide open habitats of sand dunes. But if you were to place something like one of my polycris in there, it would be a super stressful habitat for that species
Mhm.
because they're used to a much more complex, cluttered environment with like a lot more foliage to allow for their camouflage and crypsis. So, before we conclude, another consideration to keep in mind when establishing your gradients is the orientation of your enclosure. So, is it a long, short terrestrial habitat or a tall, skinny arboreal habitat? Whatever the case, it will influence your gradients. A terrestrial or horizontally oriented habitat will usually employ a horizontal gradient, whereas an arboreal or vertically oriented habitat will typically use a vertical gradient, as these models show. So again, the model on the left is kind of depicting terrestrial enclosure, whereas the one on the right is depicting more of a arboreal style setup. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, how can you determine for yourself if your gradients are working appropriately? This is something that I think is really the most important thing to take away from this in a lot of ways. And as we've stressed already, using an underlying understanding of your species, natural history, and ecology is part of it. But paying attention to what your animal is telling you with their behavior is key. How is your animal using its habitat? Is it spending all of its time basking beneath the heat element? This may suggest that it's not warm enough across the whole gradient of the enclosure. Alternatively, if your animal entirely avoids the basking area, it may suggest that the whole gradient is actually too warm. The same kind of logic applies to the other gradients established in your pet's habitat. So, again, what you want to do as a keeper when you're setting up your vivarium or your habitat for your animal is to create a habitat that encourages your animal to explore and to utilize the full volume available to it, and to utilize that in a way that is healthy and a way that allows it to express its kind of innate natural behaviors. And if you're establishing again these gradients appropriately, that should be a natural byproduct, is that you'll see your animal throughout its vivarium, throughout its habitat. In most cases, there are some species that are so passive in their lifestyle, their life strategy, that they may move very little
Yeah.
throughout their habitat, and that may be fine. Again, it may not suggest anything wrong with your gradient. Again, you want to consider what kind of species you're working with, but for the majority of reptiles, they're gonna be able to utilize the full volume of even a large enclosure, because in the natural world they're going to be moving much more across much greater distances than they would, just in our habitats that we make for them. So, is there anything you want to add on that, Phil?
No, that was brilliant.
Before
Very
we
well said.
Okay,
Very well put.
okay, great. So, yeah, that's the kind of end of our presentation here. I think I've got a slide, oh, a couple more here. So the goal of establishing gradients, again, is to empower choice in your pet while simultaneously nurturing a broad range of natural behaviors. If you're observing your pet making full use of its habitat, you can rest assured that the gradients you have provided are working to full effect. And here, again, we have another beautiful Uromastyx ornata in as part of Phil's group.
And this actually, that was a
So,
great. You want to pop back to that
yeah,
just for a quick second?
yeah,
This
yeah.
is also, I think, another thing that this particular picture illustrates is like, it doesn't have to be, uh, like insanely beautifully well crafted, material. I make
Mhm.
do with cinder blocks, bricks, cork bark, dirt and sand, grape wood, manzanita. Like, I don't build any of the interior stuff for any of my animals. It's all just material that I pick up and find useful. It doesn't have to be like tailor made, even though obviously tailor made can be really fun and it's a great project and it makes the enclosures look a specific way, and that's great. Of course it's wonderful, but it's also quite doable with easily accessible material that you can find in your yard or find at a hardware store that will, much of these things will fit the bill in a way that maybe can make it so it's easier to scale. It can be a little bit easier to put together if you're not a very crafty or handy person, such as myself. You don't have to uh, break the bank or your back really to build and put stuff together that's going to be really really useful for the animals.
Yeah, that's super well said and important. Again, it's about the behaviors that are promoted, and the functionality is the most critical aspect. And we'll be talking about this again. We've presented this exact same presentation in the past, and we're also going to be presenting a couple more that we presented in the past, including a one on composition here pretty soon
Mhm.
that'll speak to this in more depth. But it's really about what it encourages in your animal, and it's less about how it looks and more about how it functions. So that's the most important thing. And it's possible to have, a very aesthetically beautiful enclosure that is actually not very functional for your animal at all.
Oh, yeah.
And um, and it's possible to have a very utilitarian looking enclosure that is functionally hitting all the right points and allowing your animal to express itself as it should. So
Right.
um, yeah, that's always really an important thing to emphasize. So here's a kind of like exit slide here. This is where you can find Phil and I on our social media endeavors. We've had a podcast together for a long time, although I'm going to be kind of taking a break from that. Phil is going to keep it going, but you can find a whole backlog. We've got almost 100 episodes recorded of long conversations with a lot of amazing herpetoculturists and herp keepers. It's worth a listen if you're interested in that.
Hmm.
And I've also got a little basic glossary here of some of the kind of more technical terms that I was utilizing, and also just I think good terms to understand, um, for herpetoculture. So
Yep.
you can find a PDF file of this presentation on the Happy Dragons Discord. So I encourage everyone to go over and join the Happy Dragons Discord. Become part of the Happy Dragons community. We're going to be doing some really amazing stuff with Happy Dragons in the months to come. And a lot of incredible keepers and educators are involved with the project. So, yeah, highly recommend checking that out. And also would strongly encourage anyone to reach out to Phil or myself with any questions or feedback on this presentation.
Hmm.
So, with that said, I think I'm going to go ahead and awkwardly exit out of this and stop sharing my screen.
Nice. Nice
And
background.
thank you.
Yeah.
There we go. I think that should have transitioned well.
Yeah.
And now we are here and ready for the Q&A session. So if anyone has questions from the chat that they want to share, please go ahead and jump in. Um, yeah, and we'll kind of go from there. So
Well,
we've also got some links in the chat to the Happy Dragons Discord and the Happy Dragons Patreon. For those who want to check those out, please feel free. And I also want to give a huge shout out to Savannah for producing today. Um, those who have experienced our past presentations when I was producer will be thankful that Savannah has
yeah.
joined the team and is here to make this run smoothly. So thank you, Savannah.
True that.
And yeah, we'll just kind of give a moment here. I think there's also a bit of a lag. So we're going to give some time, see if there's any questions that arise. And if not, we'll just call it a day.
What's BCI? What is a BCI?
Okay, so this is a question from Shira. Hey Shira, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad you were able to find the link. So my BCI, I think that's boa constrictor imperator, the
Oh,
common
yeah, yeah,
common
yeah,
boa,
yeah, yeah.
picks a spot and stays there for weeks or more. And this could be on the warm side or the cool side. Hard to figure out what he actually wants because of this. So I think this is actually a great example of a species where I wouldn't be too concerned necessarily
Yeah.
based on that, because boas are there's a couple different points I want to speak to with this. So one is that boas are often passive feeding strategists. So they are experts at basically lying in wait,
Yep.
waiting for something to get too close, and utilizing their camouflage to help remain undetected, and then seizing the opportunity to feed. And so they're quite comfortable in many cases, staying in one place for a very long time. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about this species to consider as it relates to this gradients conversation is that this is a generalist species that
Hmm.
also has a huge distribution.
Yes.
So there are many different, subspecies, and I think there are actually some of them have been elevated to full species status within the BCI complex, let's say. Um, and they range all the way from southern Mexico all the way down to Argentina, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. And
Huge
so
range.
that's a massive distribution, and that tells us a lot about this species, is that they're very tolerant to a broad range of conditions.
Mhm.
Because even if you consider the latitude and the photo period throughout that range, you have some of those animals that are living right on the equator where they experience very little seasonal change in temperature, and they experience a 12 hours of sunlight, 12 hours of night every day, to all the way, those animals in Argentina or those animals in southern Mexico are going to experience totally different realities in their day to day in terms of
Yeah.
photo period and in terms of seasonality. And so, with species that are generalists that have these huge distributions that are really widely tolerant, they can tolerate a very wide gradient and still achieve those optimal functions essentially that we were talking about. So I think that this is a species that is it's one of the reasons why they're such a great beginner species is because they
Mhm.
are so tolerant. And a lot of the species you see in herpetoculture that have done so well and become kind of mainstays are species that are generalists like that.
And on that same line of thinking too, another, just interesting example of maybe sort of the opposite kind of situation is when you see people who keep a bearded dragon. Another example of a super commonly kept animal that is also very much kind of a generalist in the various habitats they can utilize. You'll often see, I've seen this all the time, where people mention, "Oh, my bearded dragon is sleeping in the corner of its enclosure every night," right? And it's just exposed in the corner on the sand, right? This is a different, even though that's not necessarily harmful for the animal. That's telling you something in that case about that animal is preferring something that it's trying to find in that corner, right? So there's something about that corner that makes it feel a little more snug and secure. The temperature is better than anywhere else in the enclosure at that point in time, but it could be hugging to that side because it's trying to seek something a little bit cooler, right? He's trying to find
Hmm.
somewhere a little bit cooler to be, maybe a little bit more humid to be, something like this. So when it's a much more like obscure, um, it's not really a feature, like the corner of your enclosure isn't exactly a feature in the way that we kind of tend to think about it. So that might be a different example of where it's like, oh, maybe there's something I could address here, like putting something else in that space, expanding the enclosure size, something like that might need to happen in a situation like that.
Super, super well said, Phil.
Oh no.
Okay, so next question.
Oh yeah.
What do you guys think of using computer fans to help with circulating air? Also, is it more beneficial to set them up to pull air into the enclosure or out of the enclosure?
Mm.
What would you do? So, I love this question, and I do think it's beneficial. I actually utilize computer fans a lot. I think that airflow is something that is one of those things that often doesn't really get much airtime in terms of
Hmm.
no pun intended in terms of its importance within herpetoculture and conversations about it. I think that especially for any sort of arboreal species, any sort of montane species, airflow is probably more important than we give it credit for.
Hmm.
And in my case, I do utilize PC fans a lot to help with circulating air. And usually um, my go-to is to have them pull that hot air out again for that kind of convection
Hmm.
cooling that we were talking about, and to help facilitate that happening with essentially a higher turnover. But I've also done it such that that I have one fan pushing air into the enclosure and one pulling air out,
Yeah.
one on each end. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. I think that honestly, there's probably not a huge difference between those two, at least that I'm not
Hmm.
aware of. I haven't noticed a huge difference in terms of the parameters or the behavior of the animals. Um, but I do think it's definitely beneficial. Again, sometimes too, it can help to avoid overheating an enclosure, especially if you have an enclosed enclosure like these, PVCs next to me here. These are excellent at storing heat, but they can actually that can become a liability if they're getting too warm. And
Yeah.
so if having something like a PC fan on the upper side of the hot end of the enclosure to pull that hot air out will avoid or mitigate those issues.
Yeah. Happy Dragon said, would you still provide a heat gradient, or excuse me, provide a gradient to neonates that may be prone to dehydrating? Yes, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
So again, if you refer back to the sort of visual example that I was using at the very beginning of the presentation, where I said you want to think about a gradient. If you're thinking about like a color gradient, you might have a scale that goes from black and then gradates all the way to white. Even if you shrink that to two steps from black to just a little less black, that's still a gradient, right? So even in the case of like a very very young leopard gecko, for example, right, they need to shed immediately after they hatch. They're going to be in a little bit more need of moisture on average than an adult. You might increase the overall humidity of the entire enclosure just to help with that, but it's still going to be there's still going to be a gradient within that. It's just
Hmm.
the range is just a little bit shrunk, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really a great way to say that. That's exactly how I would approach it as well.
Hmm.
To just provide potentially a slightly narrower gradient. If you're
Hmm.
concerned about dehydration, that kind of thing. Another thing to consider with that, and this may not apply in every instance, but consider if you can find information about the time of year that those neonates are being born and how that might relate to the seasonality, because it could
Yeah.
be that those species are born in the wet season,
Yep.
and so they're for that first few months of life, they do have kind of a built-in biological expectation, so to speak,
Hmm.
of higher humidity, at least for those that initial delicate stage, which is very
Yeah.
common. A
And
lot of
yeah,
species time their reproduction with those cycles.
yes, another great example of this is like Protophytus vestigium, the Baja collared lizard. You can
Hmm.
when you go find those guys out in Southern California in the wild, what you find is that if you go later in the year, anytime after like September, October, which is when a lot of the hatchlings are going to start popping out, it's slightly cooler temperatures during the day, just slightly more humidity, and you mostly see babies out active basking and eating and feeding. You don't see that many adults, right? And then the reverse happens when it gets up to like peak summer and it's like as hot as can be and it's really crazy and really wild. Most of the time, if you see something out cruising and out active, it's an adult animal. It's not going to be a baby, like a tiny little fresh baby, right?
Hmm.
So that's part of it too.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that's a fun one. I love those collared lizards, man. Baja's rule.
They're
um,
so cool.
yeah, here's another good question. This is how do you guys think about the importance of the ambient temps of your room and the placement of other enclosures that will radiate heat or to other enclosures? Yeah, excellent question.
Super important. Yeah.
Big important thing. So a simple example of this is if you have three stacked enclosures, you're going to account for that rising heat both in your ventilation and the power of basking units you're using. So on your lowest rung, you might have, just as an example, like a 75-watt halogen basking bulb. By the time you get to the top, you may only need a 25-watt basking bulb, depending on the time of year. So that's one way to compensate for it. Another is in my case, because most of my enclosures are open top, I'm usually heating and cooling the entire room seasonally as one whole unit, right? So
Hmm.
the all of the basking and UV lights act as sort of like a baseline, and then the heater inside the space acts as the sort of like the mitigating force when it either gets too cold or too hot, the heat AC, So that's another way you can do it. Now that granted, that's like a pretty big lever to have to pull. Most people won't have to do that if they're using just a few enclosures, but it is something that you do have to consider because again, if you're using an open air enclosure and you have, let's say that's your only enclosure in a single room, you're going to have a lot more compensatory mechanisms to adjust the ambient state of that enclosure because of its open air ventilation style. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
I hope that was somewhat clear. And so, yeah, it's always a balancing act, and it's something. This is why utilizing all of our tools, like our thermometers and our humidity gauges, and making sure we're using thermostats and fail safes and things like this. All of this becomes more important because as you stack and increase your number of enclosures, you also increase more variables and more possibilities for danger if
Hmm.
you're not working with just a single or few isolated enclosures. Stacking in particular becomes quite hazardous if you're not careful about temperature.
Yeah, I would second everything that Phil just added, and a few things on top of that that all contribute. again, with the stacks that you're considering, if you're keeping, like, say you have a species that prefers it cooler and another species that prefers it warmer, those cooler species you want to keep lower in your stack,
Right.
towards the bottom, the hot species up towards the top. Um, um, and one thing you can do between your enclosures that are stacked to avoid that kind of heat transfer is insulate somehow. So again, for these closed and PVC style setups, to avoid heat transfer, one thing you can do is actually put a layer of insulation foam between each enclosure.
Hmm.
So you can get insulation foam from building supply places in different thicknesses, from I think half inch to, I mean, I've seen it up to 3 inches thick, and you can basically cut it to fit the footprint of your enclosures and put it in between your enclosures to help insulate that heat creep, that heat transfer.
Hmm.
You can also create, like a little risers essentially between the enclosures. I've seen people use furniture risers,
Hmm.
which you can find, online, or sometimes at like, department stores, that kind of thing. Again, just to create more elevation between the enclosures and allow the heat to dissipate, just by creating, an insulative pillow of air between the enclosures,
Hmm.
essentially.
That's right.
Um,
That
the other
insulation
thing
foam
is,
works really, really well too. It's actually
yeah,
pretty
it's
remarkable how
super
well.
effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super effective. Another thing that's great is, or a great thing to consider, and what I do here, essentially, you ask about, like, what do you do with, like, all of your different bulbs are also increasing the ambient temperature in your room.
Hmm.
Would you worry about it getting over, just generally too hot? And that's something you always want to consider, is like, again, as you're adding more bulbs, you actually might have to start reducing the wattages in those bulbs to
Hmm.
prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, I have all of these, baby condos next to me. These all are all, they all have a little nano halogen on each of them. And depending on how many of those units are occupied at a different time, I utilize different wattages, because if every single one of those is occupied, it is a significant increase in temperature in the whole room. And so I'll drop the wattages down to like little 20-watt bulbs, whereas I could go up to 35 if, only a few of them are occupied at a time. And on top of that, I utilize a mini split in the case of my herp rooms to kind of help control the ambient temperatures. And the
Hmm.
idea with the mini splits is I try to set them so they're kind of holding the low ambient in the room. So if I want, most of the enclosures in the room to be around, 72 degrees on the cool side, say, that's my tropical species room, that's roughly around what I go for. I'll set the mini split to 72 or 73.
Hmm.
And that'll help control that. Obviously, that's not possible in every circumstance, but that's something to consider, is just the wattages that you're using. And it's also okay to, like, if it's getting warm, you want to just turn off your bulbs.
Yeah. Do that
Of
all the
course,
time.
it's good to have
All the
things
time.
on.
Like
It's good to have things
in
on
the
thermostats
summertime.
too. But
Yes,
yeah.
in the summertime, I regularly just entirely shut off basking bulbs for hours. Like it's
Mhm.
okay to do that. It's just like a cloud going in front of the sun for a few hours. It's not the end of the world. The animal's not going to die.
Mhm.
You can also stagger your shut on shut off cycles, so that way
Yep.
your top enclosures turn on first, your lower enclosures turn on last, your top enclosures turn off first, and your lower enclosures turn off last. You can do all these things to help stagger um, some of that heat transfer as well.
Yeah. And so Savannah's offered that on the fan question. Savannah's preference is to utilize that convection cooling and do the intake fans on the lower vents, while the top fans are naturally exhausting the hot air. So I think that one thing to consider with this too is, like, whether you're trying to kind of create warmer overall ambience, or you're trying to cool, you're more concerned about keeping that enclosure cool. And that may depend on the species you're working with too. You might want to have the fans on the cool side intake, or on the hot, to um, exhaust that more efficiently. So these are, I think that one thing to consider with all this too is to, like, actually experiment.
Hmm.
and see if you notice a difference in how it affects the parameters that you're striving for, and how it might affect your animal's behavior. That'll tell you. I think that there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer so much as it is like it depends on the environment that you're striving for, and your
Hmm.
also your ambient environment in terms of like your herp room or even the climate where you live.
Hmm.
But
Here's
I really
another great
appreciate
question.
Savannah putting in some insight there.
Yeah, this is a great question. Do you also think that hearing about people who keep their animals at a constant ambient temperature and having success is just the animals showing their resilience to handle the same temps? Okay, so it's a great question because I think this opens up a couple of different uh, like pipelines to answer this question. Number one
Hmm.
is yes, generally speaking, that is a generalist right there, right? So if we're
Yep.
or at least an animal that within a specific range can function very well. So something I might think about is like a ball python or a leopard gecko, right? If you can keep them at an ambient 88 and just the whole room is 88, there's no heating elements, it's just the way it is, they can function well at that range, and they can do okay, they can perform a certain set of activities. Now obviously that limits the range of behaviors and functions that the animal can perform as well. So this is where we might enter into a split conversation between what does success mean, and then also the results of generations of selective breeding. So there's two ends here, right? So on the side where we're talking about oh shit, oh my god, I lost my train of thought, I can't believe it. uh, yes. So the definition of success. My bad. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
success. That the thing that most people are going to pin as the definition of success is going to be reproductive success, right? So
Hmm.
can a set of animals reproduce viably within a limited range of conditions? And the answer for many species is going to be yes. That answer won't be the same for all species, but that is also and I'm not suggesting that the person who asked this question, Yuki, I'm not suggesting that you're saying this, but I think the definition of success that suggests that a single example of viable reproduction defines success is incorrect and incomplete.
Hmm.
So, I think it would be very unlikely to see long-term sustained success, both breeding and behaviorally and functionally, is not possible at a limited ambient range. That's not going to be possible for any species over an extended length of time. So as soon as we zoom out and expand our time scales, that becomes less viable, right? Another thing to talk about here too is again some of those species that we were mentioning, whether we're talking about a bearded dragon, ball python, leopard gecko, crested gecko, corn snake. We're talking about we're talking about animals that are representative of 30 or 50 years of selective breeding in artificial conditions that are driving them to be more flexible inside of a limited range, right? There are artificial selective pressures, which are just by the pure product of what we're doing with these animals in captivity in the first place, that are driving more animals to be successful because only the original animals that succeeded under limited conditions in the first place survive to reproduce into the future. Their offspring are the only ones that survive to reproduce into the future. So again, we are constraining success to we're forcing it to exist and happen within a more narrow range of conditions anyway. So those two forces are going to make that what you're talking about being much more commonly seen in certain
Hmm.
species. And yeah, that's that.
Super well said. Yeah, on that, Phil. I right there with you. And I honestly, personally, I see this a lot. Especially among like kind of colubrid keepers, snake keepers, that they just keep their whole room, their whole collection at ambient temperatures. And I'm personally really would not ever advocate that.
Mm-mm.
I don't think that, again, I think that um, our husbandry should be reflective of the biology of our animals on some level, and I think that, again, keeping an ectothermic species or a poikilothermic species under a constant temperature, even if it's what we might interpret as like an optimal temperature, I don't think is actually healthy because, um, as Phil was kind of describing earlier, we also want our animals to experience a diversity of temperatures because how that impacts their function and their metabolism is also part of their evolution and part of their biology, and it's important to integrate that into our captive husbandry, because
Mhm.
I think that for example, you could potentially drastically shorten a captive animal's lifespan by keeping it under optimum, quote unquote, optimum metabolic temperature year round. Because naturally, that metabolism is going to experience breaks, and it's going to when it cools down, that animal's metabolism is going to rapidly, or is going to drastically slow, or it's going to in the case of brumation, it's going to halt entirely. And these are factors that actually contribute to the wellness of our animals, and in many cases are also essential for their long term wellness, their longevity. I've actually heard this from some keepers that brumating certain species can extend their lifespan
Yeah.
by a factor of another 50%. That
Yeah.
kind of thing. It can have a huge impact on our animals. So
Yes.
a really
Yes.
important thing to bring up.
Yes, and it's definitely really important to. Sorry, this question distracted me too, but we'll get to it in a second. Sorry. It's also like it's natural. It's unfortunately sort of like a natural byproduct of the way um, the depiction of our animals on our various media platforms is influencing what we think is healthy and unhealthy behavior, right? So
Mm.
something that I
Hmm.
experience a lot with uromastics is uromastics are hard brumators. They will very regularly every fall they drop off around September, October, and then by November, December, half of them they're not even showing their faces. They don't come out, you know? So part of why that's difficult is because number one, we're not used to we don't do that. Our as humans, we don't do that. Our dogs don't do that. Our cats don't do that. Our guinea pigs don't do that. So it's not something we understand. And then most of the time, when we're told what healthy reptilian behavior looks like, brumation is not included in that conversation. A healthy
Right.
reptile is out, alert, active, eating, basking, and shitting. But
Hmm.
that is just one snapshot of what that
Hmm.
animal's actual behavior looks like. It's just one sliver of an. It would be like basing your entire care of an animal off one calendar day a year.
Hmm.
That's not how it goes. It is one entire circle. It's not it starts here and ends here. It's a whole circle that they're going around and around in until they die. you know? And
Yeah.
so just because they're in an
It's almost
inactive
like it's a
state,
gradient.
it's almost like it's a gradient, right? Weird. So it's like it's exactly. So it's not that the animal's in a brumation state and therefore something's wrong or something's unoptimal. It's just that's what they're supposed to do right now.
Hmm.
Like this is exactly what they would be doing in the wild. This is another common thing is how many of you, or both of us have experienced this, but surely some of you listening in have heard this. How many times have someone new to reptiles asked you, "Do you turn off their lights at night?" It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, of course. They have night in Africa. Like nighttime happens everywhere. And it's an innocent question. The reason they ask is because
Totally. Yeah.
what about his heat? Well, that's exactly right. What about the heat? It's supposed to drop off. It's supposed to get
Hmm.
colder. It's supposed to get wetter. It's supposed to get drier. They're supposed to eat a lot sometimes and not eat anything at all other times, right? It's just like us. We can't eat constantly all day. We can't be in a hot bath all day. We don't want to be out in the sun all day. We also want to move in and out of the shade. We want to drink more water, less water, get warmer, get colder, eat less, eat more. It's the same thing. It's just tweaked for a slightly different experience of consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, and sorry, what
Yeah,
was
and I
that?
think that in some ways, this is also part of what contributes to the resilience of our animals. Is that if they experience a diversity of conditions, a range of conditions, again within the parameters of what they might experience in their native ranges,
Hmm.
that is great. That's healthy for them. And I think that in some ways we can actually uh, potentially create animals that are less resilient to change, that are actually not as resilient to the changes that we can't control.
Yeah.
because again, there are things that are going to happen sometimes, like, you're going to lose power for a day.
Yep.
And for an animal that is used to a constant temperature all the time, that's going to be a much bigger shock to that animal than it is to one that's already experienced times where it's like it doesn't have heat that day,
Yes. Yes.
because we're taking a day to keep the heat lights off. The UV is going to be on. The LEDs are still going to come on, maybe, but no heat today because
Oh, dude.
we're replicating a cold day as it would
Yes.
be in their native range.
This is yes.
And I think that's really helpful for animals, again, in their longevity and resilience.
Yes, you can, and that's really great, Roy. And it's something you can see in other aspects of their care as well. Like I have received animals in the past that for the first couple of weeks that I have them only want to eat one food item, and it's
Yeah,
because
totally.
that's the food item that they're used to. But
Right.
if you make it a regular habit to change your animal's food sources and give them novelty, they'll be not only much more willing to explore something new, they won't be they won't develop habits, because
Hmm.
they're just like us, right? If the only thing available to you for breakfast every day is a Snickers bar, well, you're probably going to eat a lot of Snickers bars. You know what I mean? But
Hmm.
if you've got multiple options, if you have, one might say, a gradation of food choices, right? Well, then you're gonna be more likely to pick more variety. You're not going to be as shocked when something changes. How many of you have dogs who the second you change their food, they have diarrhea? Right?
Hmm.
Well, that's some of that's a result of the artificial additives and the various things that different dog producers will put in their food, but some of it's also the shock to the system of a novel food item. It's not used to
Hmm.
seeing that. Its gut flora is not adapted to that. It's not resilient enough to handle that. So, in some ways, many of the choices that we're making for our herps is to help keep them. You want them to be resilient, sturdy animals that can
Hmm.
can withstand change because that's what they're supposed to be. They're built to be that. That's exactly what
Right.
they are. Um,
Yeah.
Franklin
So we
asks,
got
yeah, sorry, go ahead,
couple
bro. My bad.
questions. Yeah. Yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
James. So James said, Phil, Roy, favorite observations of animals using any gradient in some way in captivity or the wilds? Oh man, this is a really good question.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Hmm.
I mean, a simple one. The one that I really love right now is I have these baby Moroccan tortoises, and those things, they're like, every time I soak them, it's like watching little old men in a hot tub. You're like, what are you doing, guys? But they they I have for them a an enclosure with it's like it's like 3-4 inches of repti soil, a layer of cypress mulch on top of that, and then scattered around the cypress mulch are cork flats, or, well, not flats proper, but like cork
Hmm.
chunks of cork bark that lay over the top of sphagnum moss. And I that the not only does the lower layer stay moist, but the sphagnum moss stays nice and moist. And
Hmm.
every single night, those little old men dig into the sphagnum moss under the cork, and they hang out inside those. It's so funny. It's so
I
cute.
love it.
But yeah,
Yeah.
those tortoises are the funniest things I've ever kept. They're hilarious.
I love that.
Yeah.
One that comes to mind for me is it's less one animal observation, but it's more like how um, the different animals in the Suriname biotope utilize the gradient, and how that expresses their different niches in their native range.
Yeah.
So um, one thing I really like about that enclosure is that the animals that live in there, they tend to hang out in different parts of the enclosure, and not because necessarily they're avoiding each other or anything like that, but because they naturally prefer slightly different things, which also reduces competition between them in the enclosure. I think it just makes for a much more functional habitat overall,
Hmm.
um, for a mixed species display, which we can get into that whole can of worms another time maybe. But I really love that, like the Uranoscodon, the diving lizard, I think they're sometimes called, or a brown tree climbing lizard.
Uh-huh.
Um, this is an understory species, and they actually don't love direct light. A lot of the time, they actually will they'll try to avoid it much of the time, and so one thing I've noticed is that sorry, I had to just plug in my computer; it wasn't plugged in all the way. Um,
Unbelievable.
is that they'll kind of hang out in this kind of mid range in terms of the elevation of the vivarium, where there's like some light penetration, but it's not this like really intense bright light like it is right at the top of the enclosure. And the polychrus lizards that I have in there, the monkey lizards, really like that bright light, and so they're always up in that top range. And I almost never see them lower, except for when they're going down to roost at night. They'll descend to the lower branches. But I love seeing that, just like how
Yeah.
these different species that prefer different things, they occupy different niches and different kind of strata, within the habitat, are doing that same thing in the vivarium. It's really
Yeah.
fun for me to see.
Absolutely. So Ryan asked a good question here. I'm curious about animals that don't prefer direct sunlight. In that case, would you only turn them on for a little, use plants to provide shade slash direct light, or yeah, essentially yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Something to add here that I think is interesting. A justification that I heard a very very long time ago um, for example, for rat keeping was somebody, I remember somebody saying, well, they're nocturnal, so they don't need light. And last time I checked, that's there's light at night from the moon. Like yeah, of course, occasionally you get the new moon cycle, so you might get like a night or two where it's extra dark because there's very little
Hmm.
light. But just because something's nocturnal, by definition, doesn't mean number one that it doesn't see a gradation of light quality over the course of a month, but also doesn't mean it doesn't mean that they're exclusively out once it's pitch black, right?
Hmm.
They're also going to do everything from cryptic basking to using very low light angle basking, all of this stuff, right? So even I keep some of the Eublepharis angermanu, which is the absolutely enormous leopard geckos. I've kept them for a long time. They're actually super cool, but I keep them with very low wattage light and
Hmm.
like a 25-watt halogen and a UV, a low output UV. And I keep it on for the same daylight hours, right? On for the same hours as the Euros, and they change where they're located during the day. They don't, they're not
Hmm.
out hanging out under the light basking, but the second the lights turn on in the morning, they come out from their burrows and go under a stone. It's like a broken up chunk of roof tile that's underneath the halogen, and they will sit not just under the halogen where it's radiating heat through the tile, but there's holes like it only lines up like maybe like this, and there'll be
Hmm.
light shining right through that hole, and they'll sit right under the light. Well,
Yep.
that's cryptic basking, right? I mean, that's like
Absolutely.
that's
Yep.
exactly what that is. It's dappled in painting. We used to call this dappled light, which is where you're
Yeah.
talking about like sunlight that's coming through trees and leaves. It dapples the forest floor. That's what a lot of these animals will use as well. So it's very rare to have an animal that doesn't is just doesn't mean they never see light. And I'm not suggesting
Yeah.
that you're saying that, Ryan, at all. It's just something that comes to mind here when we're talking about how, remember, all the animals are living on the same planet. So they're using all the same tools, they're just using them differently. And remember,
Yeah.
so just remembering that those tools are going to look different based on your animal, which is why knowing a little bit about their natural behavior and their ecology is so informative. And in another conversation we'll probably get into how body type and body structure can inform you about what that animal's natural behavior and ecology looks like, right? Because certain flat compressed lizards are very likely to be crevice dwelling lizards, and certain
Right.
lizards that are built in a specific way are going to be more likely to be arboreal types, or whatever it is, or more adept at climbing or what have you. So just visually, just looking at your animal and what it's shaped like can tell you a lot about what its needs are, because body type is a gradient.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And Ryan, we did go over light gradients in the presentation too. So this should get uploaded. It'll be on YouTube. I think we might upload a new version, just that'll have slightly higher quality than the live version on YouTube. But in either case, you'll see this presentation on there. And I would definitely say check out the light gradient section in that. But yeah, I kind of lean the same way as Phil on this, where I provide the same kind of light source for most of my species that prefer more shade. But what I do is I create more clutter and more complexity in the vivarium to create that dappled light that Phil was talking about. And so I really like placing like branches at angles
Yeah.
in the vivarium to kind of create like almost like to break up the dimensional space so that the animals can like kind of get under the lattice of those branches, and they've got a little bit more shade, or they can be on top of those branches directly under that light and
Yep.
get much more direct light. I think that's a good way to do that.
And obfuscating that light
So
also naturally reduces the temperature at the surface too, right? So
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. It's a great way to do that, and again, like that's often when I'm like seeing herps in the field. Like particularly, I really love going out and seeing rattlesnakes, and just observing
Oh
them.
yeah.
And a lot of the times when I'm going out and seeing them in the fields, they're hanging out in these really lovely dappled light areas where they can cryptically bask, essentially,
Hmm.
just like Phil was describing. Where they're partially exposed to the light, but they're still able to feel the security of some cover,
Hmm.
and to not feel directly threatened by exposure, essentially. So
Muy importante.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm just
So
getting
I
a
think that I think that that's it. If there's any last questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get to them. Otherwise, I think we'll call it a night. And I really want to say thank you to everybody who's participated. This has been a great
Mhm.
conversation. I really appreciate everyone's questions and the insights that everyone shared in the chat. It's awesome to be interacting with folks who care about their animals and really want to provide a high level of care for them. So thanks so much for prioritizing that and being part of this. It's really appreciated.
Hell yeah.
Okay, I
Give
think
it a
that's
call,
it.
huh? Yeah.
Thanks everybody. We appreciate
Gracias.
you, and check out Happy Dragons. Join the Discord.
Yeah,
Get
yeah.
involved. You're all welcome there, and yeah, we're looking to build this into something special, into a powerful, helpful resource for everyone. So we'd love your involvement and feedback.
Hell yeah.
Okay,
Nice.
sweet.
Okay. I'm gonna close my